It's only natural to assume that someone who calls themselves a writer reads books. Well, actually, there are writers out there who don't read other books, and so they're not learning the tools of the trade to write books. I don't really get it either. But you can usually assume that someone who writes books also reads them. A question that I get asked a lot as a reader is, what is my favourite book? And I never really know how to answer that question because I do read a lot of books that I really enjoy. And I would say I have multiple favourites, so it's really hard for me to just pick one. So maybe we should stop asking the question, what is your favourite book? And start asking the question, what book has changed your life the most? Or what books have changed your life the most? And that's what this video is today. I'm going to answer my own question. What books have changed my life the most? Starting with Just Kids by Patti Smith. I love this book. I read this book last year and it has had such a profound impact on me. This book is basically a homage to New York and Patti Smith's life as an artist in New York. It records her love life and friendship with Robert Mapplethorpe, as well as his death. It records her blossoming and blooming as an artist and the people that she met throughout her time in New York City, and it details her life from poor to successful in a really beautiful and poetic way. This book really comforted me because it made me feel like just because I don't have the tools or the money to be a successful artist, I just have to keep going, and that tragedy will befall me and things will happen and I will meet people along the way, and I just need to enjoy the journey and just allow myself to become an artist in whatever time it takes to get there. This next book is Monkey Grip by Helen Garner. This book is such a delight. It's one of the first Australian literature books that I have read that has had a major impact on me and my writing and my goals as a writer. The book is basically about a dysfunctional relationship between a woman and her heroin addict partner while she's raising a kid in a share house in Melbourne during the 1970s. It's chaotic, it's also beautiful and heartbreaking, and it feels really real and really true. And I believe that Helen Garner actually went through a lot of the things that are in this book, and she has described it as She describes this book as semi-autobiographical, and I think you can really tell with a book like this because it rings true and it makes you feel all kinds of things. And the reason this book is one of the books that changed my life is because it is probably the piece of Australian literature that steered my direction away from where my writing was going. And I decided I wanted to show the raw grit of reality. I wanted to show people at their lowest because that's what the neighborhood that I grew up in was like. These are the sorts of people that I was dealing with and speaking with and hearing about. So I will forever love this book. This next book is Hal Kadish and Other Poems by Allen Ginsberg. Now, this book was the first book by Allen Ginsberg that I'd read, and I was mainly reading the book so I could read the infamous poem Howl. And my first attraction to this book was how culturally significant it was, because there were obscenity trials about this book. It was banned, it was censored, and Allen Ginsberg and the Beat Generation had to fight to get this book back on the shelves. Authors publishing themselves, fighting an establishment, and making a name for themselves. Some of my favourite poems in this book are Howl, as well as Footnote to Howl. Supermarket in California is a big favourite of mine. I also really enjoy, and I'm just going through it to sort of remind myself, I really liked America. I think that one was one of Allen Ginsberg's most political poems, which I really enjoy because I am a political person and I read a lot about politics, and these things mattered to people back then, and there are things today that matter to us that I think will always come out in art. And so America is one of those poems that I really admire because it tackles critical social issues. But for me, it's kind of an example of what poetry can do and how it can be critical of society. I think I also really like this book because it's one of the ones that encouraged me to just give it a go. To write a book without worrying about who my publisher was going to be, or to just write a book and publish myself and not worry too much about what that's going to mean later on. This gave me the courage to put my work out there and have my words seen and start from the bottom up, which is what I've done and what I'm still doing. So it is a very encouraging and inspiring book for me. This next book is The Flame by Leonard Cohen. And I believe this was published after he passed away. I think that was 2016. And at the time that he'd passed away, I actually wasn't that familiar with Leonard Cohen. I wasn't really listening to his music. I'd sort of heard one or two. Wasn't a major fan at the time. And yes, so I decided that I wanted to read this book without having even read The Book of Longing, which is the main Leonard Cohen poetry book that people talk about. But no, I started with his last book, The Flame, which actually also includes diary entries and drawings that he had done in his notebooks. And as you can see, I have marked it up considerably because I analysed the shit out of this book and learned a lot about Leonard Cohen in the process. And somehow, in some strange, posthumous way, I began to idolise or admire the man. And so I started listening to his music, and I started meditating actually because of this book, because Leonard Cohen was known to go into the mountains and hang out with monks and meditate for long periods of time. And that was something that I had never considered doing before, and I still have not done. But the best that I could do was meditate in my bedroom. And I was going through a very hard time while I was reading this book. It was the middle of the pandemic, and it has imprinted on me. I have learned so much about myself, so much about love, and I learned a lot about being calm and being present. And of course, it just got me into Leonard Cohen's music, which I think is beautiful, and you should listen to You Want It Darker, which is one of his last songs before he died. It's a beautiful song. While we're talking about meditation and spirituality, we're going to move on to the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Now, this is a complicated book to explain because, in a way, it's a book of, you could call it poetry, but it's not really poetry. These are verses, and I believe there's 82 of them, I think. 81, my bad. There are 81 verses in this book, and each verse is a little bit different, and they are transcriptions that detail Taoism. Now, Tao itself is a strange concept, but basically it means way, or the way, and it is all about being calm and being peaceful, not acting hastily, accepting and living in the present and the now, if you want to interpret it that way, because there are many different interpretations and there are many different translations. And I've collected about 6 or 7 different translations myself, and I've read all of them, all at once. Every time I would read one, I would move on to another translation and I would read that because I was infatuated with the concept of the Tao and it made me feel better. The Tao, the One. It just feels so soothing to me. And I would even potentially put it out there that this book changed my life more than any other book. Because there was a period of my life where I was really angsty and unhappy with my life. And I think this is the book that may have turned my life around. Now, this next book is really, really dear to my heart. This is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's a little bit of an outlier on this list because it's probably the only fantasy book that I have here, despite the fact that for quite a while I only read fantasy books. And maybe that's why this book is here, because this is probably the first major fantasy book that I read, even though it's also just a children's story. This book is gorgeous. I love the story of Bilbo Baggins with the 13 dwarves going on a quest to defeat a dragon and get some gold. I love the adventures throughout the middle. I love meeting all the different characters and the worlds, and the elves and dwarves and spiders and goblins and trolls and the Shire and hobbits, of course. I thought all of that was just immaculate. So that escapist world was just such a haven for me. And to this day, I still want to go to New Zealand just so I can see Hobbiton. I don't know why I haven't done that yet. If you give me some money, I'll go to New Zealand. Tolkien has had a huge impression on me, and he's probably the writer who got me into writing seriously. And so for most of my high school years, I was working on several different fantasy manuscripts, and I had assumed that I was going to be a fantasy writer. Things have turned around a little bit, and I'm not sure today whether fantasy is my genre. I love to read it from time to time, and I'll always come back to the Tolkien books. But I don't believe I have what it takes to write a fantasy novel. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe one day I will write a fantasy novel. Maybe I'll write a series of fantasy novels. But for the time being, I'm going to focus on reality because it's what I know best. Before I get to the last one, I just wanted to throw in a sneaky mention of the Lord of the Rings books, because you can't talk about The Hobbit without the Lord of the Rings, really. The Lord of the Rings books are the real trilogy that changed my life, but I didn't want to include a trilogy, I just wanted one book, so I went with The Hobbit because it is The Hobbit that started the journey that I went on in my youth into becoming a writer. And I got these beautiful editions as a birthday present a few years ago, and I don't know how old they are actually, but they are pretty old. I wouldn't say they're in the greatest condition, but they're definitely old, and so this looks like this is an 11th impression of The Return of the King from 1965. Pretty cool. And finally, this last book, which I know you saw at the start of the video and you've been waiting for, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I love this book. Of course I love this book on many different levels. On a storytelling level, on an aesthetic level, obviously. And I also love this book because it's about a bunch of students getting into trouble and doing mischievous things and meeting up at secret times of the day, and all of that just sounds like the perfect plot for a book, perfect characters for a book. And it's only natural that someone who studied for as long as I have before I dropped out would be interested in the life of students. I may not have been a languages student or a literature student, but I was a writing student, and so they're loosely related. But this book makes me wish that I studied the classics, makes me wish that I learned ancient Greek or Latin. As devastating as this book is also just full of jokes. There are so many jokes in Latin and ancient Greek that they went over my head the first time, but eventually I realized that so much of the language in this book is actually foreshadowing. Now I think this book is important to me because it sort of, while it gives me cult vibes, while it sort of scares me a little bit, but while I'm also in awe of it, I think this book makes me want to have a group of writers around me who I can establish friendships with, a group of people that I can get up to mischief with and just live. A group of people whose energy I can just absorb and feel everything and live life like nothing matters. That's what that book gives me, and for quite a long time I have just preferred to be on my own while I'm reading or while I'm working on a project. But this book makes me want to be the sort of artist who interacts with other artists all the time. I want to live with them, I want to eat dinner with them and bounce off their energy and head out onto the town with them, and I want to make memories with artists. I want to learn from them, I want them to learn from me. Is it so bad for me to want a group of like-minded artists and writers who love literature and want to be writers and band them all together and go on mischievous adventures and travel and live and love and laugh? I can't believe I just said live, love, laugh. But it's true, these are important things, really. But this book makes me realize the things that I really need in my life to be a happy artist. So these are 7 books that have had lasting impressions on me. I think they've changed my life for the better. They've definitely changed my life in some way. And they're definitely books that I will read again someday. I love rereading books and I don't get to do it very often, but I think I should just let loose and reread some of my favorite books, the books that changed my life.
Thank you for coming over, man. I really appreciate it. Just wanted to ask a couple questions about this release. So we'll get into it. I mean, you wrote a book. How does that feel?